My name is Monica Sklar, and I'm the Vice President of Technology for Fashion Studies M.A. I'm also a fashion history professor at the University of Georgia, where I manage the historic clothing and textiles collection. The topic for this panel is Beyond Standardization, the Diverse Bodies of Fashion, where scholars will engage in a discussion about the diversity and inclusivity regarding the relationship of dress to body ability, size, and changing silhouettes. Our panel today represents experts from academia, museums, industry, and activism to consider what makes the norms of body standards and how this dialogue has evolved throughout modern history. Let's welcome our moderator for today, Francesca Granata. Francesca is an associate professor of fashion studies in the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons School of Design. Her research centers on modern and contemporary visual material culture, with particular focus on fashion history and theory, gender, and performance studies. Her monograph, Experimental Fashion, Performance Art, Carnival, and the Grotesque Body, was in 2017 in Bloomsbury, and it examines the way that experimental fashion at the turn of the 21st century mediated shifting gender norms and the AIDS crisis. Her forthcoming edited collection, An Anthology of Fashion Criticism, will be published by Bloomsbury in February of this year, 2021.
I will start by introducing the panelists and in alphabetical order. First is Dr. Charity Armastatt. She is the Fashion Merchandising Program Director and Assistant Professor at Brunel University in Gainesville, Georgia. And she manages the Brunel Historic Clothing Collection. She holds a Ph.D. in Apparel Merchandising and Design from Iowa State University, Master's from the University of Georgia, with a focus in historic and cultural dress and textiles. Her research interests include home sewing, retro sewers, the history of sewing patterns, historic maternity clothing, and the evolution of sewing technique. Next is Calla, who is a PhD student in communications and culture at Ryerson and York Universities. Her research explores Fat identity construction and performance, with particular attention to the ways in which Fat activist practices enforce boundaries around acceptable expression of fatness. Calla is a research associate at the Center of Fashion and Systemic Change and the Creative Communities in Collaboration Research Lab. Both are at Ryerson University. Next is Keena, so Charity and Calla, now you can finally see them. Keena Hudson, who is a recent Fashion Studies M.A. graduate from Parsons School of Design. She has research experience in fat studies, apparel design, and apparel merchandising. Her pedagogy and design methods include a more human-centered approach that values incorporated theory, technical designs, and the experience of marginalized people. Keena advocates for bodies of all sizes in the fashion industry and the design education sector. Currently, she's developing a curriculum for an online technology course and is teaching at the New School here in New York. Keena guides her research and work with the vision of making a more equitable and inclusive fashion system and industry. Then we have my colleague, Grace Yoon, who works at the intersection of accessibility and design. She creates learning opportunities for students to directly engage with aging communities and disability groups to co-design dressing solutions. Her research bridges communities such as rehab centers, material manufacturers, 3D printing companies, and creatives to co-create accessible design solutions. She's CEO at Open Style Lab, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to make style accessible for all. Grace's thought leadership has received nationwide attention and has been featured in the New York Times, Vogue, and most recently Forbes. She has been asked to speak about this topic of disability and design at events and conferences worldwide. Finally, we have Dr. Lauren Peters, who is Assistant Professor of Fashion Studies and Director of the Fashion Studies Collection at Columbia College in Chicago. She holds a PhD in Fashion Studies from the Center of Fashion Studies at Stockholm University and an M.A from the Fashion Studies program at Parsons School of Design. She is the editor-in-chief of the Fashion Studies Journal, and the research has been widely published in peer-reviewed journals, including Fashion Theory, Critical Studies in Fashion and Beauty, and the Journal of Curatorial Studies. She's currently working on a monograph titled Fashioning the Flesh, Fashion, Fatness, and Femininity in Early 20th Century America, which is forthcoming with Bloomsbury in 2022. So as you can see, we have such an impressive list of panelists whose approach to this idea of diverse bodies in fashion is quite different from one another. But I wanted to start with a question that, although in general, I wanted to start by asking Grace, who works on design and disability, of course, fashion design specifically. So what do you think, and Grace also works with industry quite closely, so I wanted to ask her, what do you think of the norms perpetuated by the fashion industry, and how race and ethnicity play a role in those definitions?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for having me and Francesca. It's also really good to see you again, everyone who's making time tonight to be here. I think I see several things that are perpetuated by the industry in terms of visual or bodies that defy, I think, certain races and genders that are often frequently highlighted. Most of the time, it's either in advertisement or in beauty or in accessories or clothing design. Particularly for people with disabilities. So just to give some background, you know, disabilities is such a wide scope and there's a variety, but 1 out of 5 people identify having a disability in the United States, according to the US Census. And so therefore, you know, there's different varying needs that aren't always considered, I think, by the industry when talking about race, ethnicity, or gender that correlates with ability. So if you have a physical disability versus an invisible disability, sometimes those things are not always accounted for. And in the States, and particularly a lot of Asian Americans and Blacks are identified being the most in that population for disability. So that's also something that isn't always really reflected in terms of visual culture or media representation.
Thank you. And what about the rest of the panelists? Do you want to jump in about this idea of norms within the fashion industry?
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here tonight. I'm so thrilled to be on this panel. I'm really grateful for the invitation. I mean, for my part, as you guys heard, my research area is plus size fashion, history and theory. And whenever I was at Parsons in particular, I did a lot of research into media representations of fat bodies, but we've also seen the industry change a lot over the last 10 years, at least since I was doing my MA. And certainly the industry has become more inclusive. We're seeing more fat bodies, more bodies of diverse shapes and sizes represented within the media. But another kind of troubling trend that I've seen personally is the creation of a new fat ideal. I'm sure Calla can speak to this as well, for sure, but the image of acceptable fat embodiment that we've seen in the media and that's been circulating within advertisements and in the beauty industry is a fat body with curves in all the right places, and oftentimes a body that's white or light skinned. So it's almost like the goalposts continue to be moved, and you know, even though we're seeing more representation in the fashion industry, it's still this unattainable ideal. Of course, the fashion industry barters in exclusivity and this fantasy, and unfortunately, we're still not quite there yet in terms of achieving true parity or full representation in the fashion media. I also note that the intersections of fatness and race are kind of a blind spot within the field of fashion studies. This is definitely an area that needs more work done around it. But to that end, I will call out Sabrina Strings' research. She just wrote an incredible book called Fearing the Fat Body, and it's not the fat black body, or fearing the black body, and it's all about the racial origins of fat phobia and size. Her book's not explicitly about fashion, but she does draw upon a lot of magazines and advertisements in her work, so it's definitely worth checking out. But definitely this is an area that needs more research in our field.
And I wanted to follow up with that, asking, so there is definitely, the fashion industry is undergoing a process of change towards greater inclusivity. Monica earlier was telling me about this fashionista Barbie, which are supposedly, I don't know if any of you have seen it, are supposedly representing a range of body types and races. And yet, I feel like on one hand, that's true, but yet, like, we also hear a lot about Spanx, body shaping garments, which are quite ubiquitous, and adaptive fashion has not really become mainstream, I believe. So I was wondering what you think of that. Do you think that is shifting in an aging population, so where disability are even going to be more common, and a shifting size of the population? Will they push fashion industry to change even more quickly?
I mean, I think aging and disability has definitely made some headway, and especially with adaptive fashion on the rise in the early 2000s. But I think it's more than that, right? We're in an era where we're so connected that we understand a lot of the making processes, which is why sustainability and labor rights have come into so much transparency these days. So there are no, at least in my opinion, enough disabled designers or people of representation that are in the category of aging and disability, rather than just the surface representation, which I think a lot of companies today are now making a bit more effort to put into their diversity and inclusion initiatives. But in terms of academic studies, there's a huge gap, as I think we've just mentioned, even with FAT studies, because there's a area that's on the kind of border between accessibility, fashion, and then of course wearability factors. And that kind of is a combination of looking at historic evidence from assistive technology to looking at fashion studies and construction to a blend of what's like needed today. And a good example is like the masks that we had a big crisis of given the pandemic. And now why weren't like fashion companies or even fashion experts consulted, I think, for medical masks is also, questionable. So it's not just for, I think, disability or aging, but being inclusive of disability is something that it just benefits everyone, because as we age, we will experience some form of disability, and therefore we're designing for a greater, wider population of people who aren't a certain body type forever. More so, I think adaptive fashion can learn a lot from the plus size segment in terms of business and marketing. Many people said it was too customized, like it's not going to work for the market for having plus size garments. But look at it now, it's grown tremendously. And so I think adaptive fashion is kind of following suit in a similar way.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to comment about the changes in the industry? Yeah.
One thing that I'm finding interesting is, as we've discussed, there's been more representation of people with different body sizes, different races and ethnicities in advertising and the media. But one thing that I've noticed from studying the history of sewing patterns is that in some ways, I think we've lost some of the size diversity that used to be available. For instance, one of the things I got, which I wish I had it with me, it's in my office at work. The pattern companies back, I'd say this was probably at least 1940s through 1960s, they were putting out Mrs. sizes, women's sizes, half sizes, juniors, teens, and sub-teens. So if you look at the measurement charts for these, they're all very different. They were all geared towards a different body type, and it offered people a lot more options. If you go and look at the pattern company catalogs now, you've got plus size, misses, and sometimes if you're lucky, you've got a petite. And really that's about it. So one reason I'm thinking it could be part of it is the increased popularity of knits, that knits tend to fit a wider range of body types. And I think maybe it's led to a certain, I'm trying to think of a better word for this, but maybe taking shortcuts or a little bit of laziness in design, that people are not as, designers are maybe less concerned with fit of woven garments, and it's led to a loss of precision.
That's interesting. I kind of wanted to go back to this idea of representation before we delve a little bit more into the idea of sizing, pattern making. And this question is for Calla, but again, I know many of you, including Lauren, work on social media, worked on social media. And I was curious, how do you think social media has impacted norms in fashion, right? So on the one hand, we see social media as having opened up the range of bodies that are at least represented, as well as a venue for activism. And on the other hand, though, I believe that the most famous and well-paid influencers do not seem to stray very much from a certain norm, right? A cisgender, often white, thin, young. So I was just curious your thoughts on that, Calla, because I also know you work in that field.
Great, thank you. I think that's really important to consider, and that sort of goes to what we've been talking about. And I think I just want to say, sort of going off of what the last two questions were, I think there is a real, like, apparent lack of attention to intersectionality and the fact that you can be fat and disabled, right? You can need plus size adaptive clothing. You can, and I think that that's one of the things that is coming out of activism that's happening in social media spaces. So a lot of my work looks at folks who are at the largest end of the fat spectrum. So those who are sort of plus out of plus size. And for that sort of group, social media has been a really important space of community organizing and being able to access, calling companies out on the use of terms like inclusive sizing or for every body, and being able to sort of speak back against that rhetoric and say, no, I am here, you can see me, this doesn't fit me, therefore it's not for everybody. So I think it's both that channel for access to companies to say, to sort of call them out on a lot of the performative actions that they're doing, but also raise awareness to, it's not just, I'm not just plus size, I'm not just fat, I can also be fat and non-binary, and wanting to access clothing that speaks to all parts of my identity. I think social media really provides that platform. But exactly what you're saying, Francesca, so many of these influencers, they just, I think of it as a circle, and they're just pushing that boundary out just a little bit, but not far enough, right? So at the same time that it's an avenue for folks to speak back, we're seeing that change and moving at a molasses pace, I think.
Thank you. And anybody have anything to add about social?
I was gonna definitely sorry, thank you. I was gonna add to Calla's statement about social media. I think it's definitely shifted from the past to where we would originally see, like Lauren, Calla, you were both talking about these tokenized fat bodies that we would see. That's kind of pushed through fashion companies, and social media has definitely been a great place where these people can do this kind of social justice work and activism. And really promoting bodies that are, in every in life, and just different bodies that aren't like this token kind of fat ideal that fashion companies have kind of run with. So it's definitely it has shifted, and it's provided, I think, a space for fat people to really include their own narrative and not get kind of washed up in this commercialized fashion industry. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I just want to jump into and shortly acknowledge that a lot of the language that we see circulating within mainstream social media spaces being perpetuated by body inclusive influencers came from fat activism, which has its origins in the 1960s, which manifested later on in the early 2000s in what was known as the fatosphere and in activist fashion blogs as well as zines. So it's been interesting and sort of troubling to see the way that this very activist language that came from these movements like Health at Every Size has been sanitized. And, Calla used the term performative and is being performed in these spaces. So you have thin, privileged people who are, flaunting a bit of cellulite or something, but they don't actually suffer from bias within the fashion industry in any meaningful way. So it's like two sides of the same coin. Like, these people exist in the same social media ecosystem on the same platforms, but they're having two very different conversations. But I will say that like one thing that's been exciting, speaking to what Keena and Calla both talked about, is the way that these people are carving out creative spaces for themselves, and really creating, spaces of agency and, playing with fashion and finding joy in fashion where the industry isn't really serving them, as well as meaningfully pushing the industry to change. She's on the smaller side of the spectrum, but the woman who does the 12-ish style, who's Katie Storino, whose name was escaping me for a minute, she had a really popular, has a really popular hashtag campaign called Make My Size, where she's actually pushed brands to create clothing in her size. So I do think there's a lot of power within these social media spaces to move companies to change, but it certainly shouldn't only be on the shoulders of these influencers.
And then from representation, I want to go back to the actual garments. And this question is from Keena, but really I think applies to all of you. And if you think about standardization, which is in the title of this talk, and norms, they're really embodied through fashion, through sizing, pattern making, garment construction techniques, right? In a very real sense, although somebody mentioned that the use of knit fabric has made that a little less central. See, Charity mentioned that. So I was just curious, what is the learning curve for a designer to create clothing that are in fact more inclusive of a range of bodies that have different abilities, right? And how do we also incorporate that in design education?
Yeah, so I definitely focus more on design education and academia and the language that we use around fat design, fat fashion, designing for these marginalized bodies. And I think what really needs to happen in the classroom is kind of this changing of language. And I had the great opportunity of being in Grace's class and kind of analyzing and seeing how the change in the language that really helps, I think, these students understand that there is a group of marginalized people out there that are having difficulty in fashion and in society. And I think unfortunately these classes can be kind of a more like specialized and elective class. And I think where we really need to see the shift is creating this like as a main part of the curriculum. But I think in my research, I definitely found that language needs to change within textbooks. A lot of them are still quite harmful in the language they use towards fat bodies and patterns as well, talking about fat bodies and disabled bodies too as kind of like problem areas and things within these textbooks. So there's still this perpetuation of the language that needs to change.
Grace, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the question is more like how maybe each of us have practiced it within our own academic and scholarly fields or classrooms, right? And has just been in my class. I try my best to bring at least a person with a disability in the course because we're so used to seeing the models, especially come in that are certain sizes or only range in certain sizes, as well as body forms or dress forms that I think are great ways to start practicing draping, pattern making, and initial sketches, but that's not the only body type. And if that's the first type you're introduced to, it sometimes becomes a staple, I think, in the student's mind that is the only form that they get used to designing on and designing with. So a lot of the times I've tried to push in the narrative of placing people with disabilities as co-designers and collaborative in the process. That's been, I think, challenging in its own way to pay respect to, I think, a lot of the fashion terminology and techniques that is being swung around in the classroom versus, I think, just like human-centric language, asking someone first how they want to be identified, how do they describe themselves? Am I a disabled person? Am I a person with a disability? And really just kind of unpacking, here today, why we're even talking about disabilities, because having inaccessible clothing is a basic violation to your human right. Because if you can't find the clothes that enable you to, for example, get a job or do a uniform or perform a certain function to participate in society, it is prohibiting you to take activity and to take part in groups of people. So I think that type of humanism and activism is also deeply ingrained in that clothing, food and living circumstances, those three basic fundamental things of human living, are still not met, especially for some people. And I think that's kind of the point I tried to drive home in the beginning of language and context, which is another series of courses that I hope many of the people in the audience understand and unpacking as well.
Thank you, Grace. And I wanted to ask Charity to follow up on that, also in terms of this idea of, historical, an historical point of view. I know you have done a lot of work on the history of pattern making and sewing for pregnancy. So for pregnant bodies, which are this body in the process of transformation. And I was just curious if there was something you learned there that I think you could be applied to other spheres.
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. You said, so your question was what from the study of maternity clothing could be applied to other areas as well?
Right, because the maternity clothing is this kind of dress that's supposed to fit a body that's like in the process of becoming, right? It's a very specific kind of body. So, and then you have an historical point of view. So I was wondering if you could add to this conversation from your story.
Yeah, I think the most significant challenge with designing maternity clothing has been that it is made to fit a rapidly changing body. I think one of the sources I was looking at earlier said that typically during pregnancy, the waist measurement will change about 10 inches and below the waist is more. So I think maternity clothing could be applicable to other areas in that perhaps areas of people with fluctuating weight or a changing body type, and devising clothing that is adaptable to changes in the body. So I think that kind of like size movement is perhaps the most applicable part of it. The other thing that's possibly relevant there is this idea, essentially for the history of maternity clothing, looking at the entire 20th century and into the 21st, is that maternity clothing is always based on what the predominant style is to achieve a given body type. The irony there is that that ideal is never the pregnant body type. I don't think it has been since the Renaissance. So it's taking a body that does not fit the predominant ideal and trying to dress it in clothing that does fit that ideal. And that's something that was done a lot. You see that a lot late 19th century through the 40s. And it's just in the 50s that we kind of start to see a little bit more of a development of a style that is really more maternity specific and has a little bit less relation to the predominant silhouette of the period. And now I think we've maybe even to a degree lost that, and it's kind of swung back to trying to get the pregnant body to fit current social norms.
It definitely does point us towards the direction. I mean, I'm not a designer, but it's interesting, this idea also co-design, it seems central in designing for a variety of body types, as Grace does in her work. But I wanted to find out also from other people, since we're all here in education, how do you think, not just in the design realm, but also in, for those that were more historian and theorists, Laura and Calla, how do you integrate this in your work, in your teaching, not just your research?
So first, there was a question in the chat about terminology, and since Grace mentioned the importance of language, I think it's worth addressing this sooner rather than later. But you'll notice, you have all probably noticed that a lot of us are using the term fat, and we're not using it in the pejorative sense. Rather, we're kind of drawing upon standards established within the emerging field of fat studies, which is in itself has roots in activism, and that field has consciously reclaimed the term fat as a neutral descriptor. Plus size and all of the terms that have come before it, stout, matronly, whatever, are kind of recognized as constructs, which have roots in different beauty ideals in different periods. So, you know, because a lot of our work is activist in nature, I think I don't want to speak for everyone, but personally, I choose to use the term fat as a neutral descriptor, because plus size, you know, that's also been recently called to, you know, be abolished by people within the movement. So it is a minefield, but it is important. Thank you for bringing that up to address why we're using the language that we're using. So I hope that clears things up. But in terms of education, yeah, it's challenging. So I teach within a fashion studies department where we have tracks in fashion merchandising and fashion design. And I'm sort of one of the designated historians and theorists and, you know, the professor who asks those big questions about why we wear what we wear. So quite simply and obviously in courses that are, you know, like the sociology of dress, it's about incorporating fat studies literature and also carving out space for students to talk about their own lived experiences, which can be really fruitful. As Grace was talking about, you know, design school really needs more human-centered design, and a lot of that work can begin with having conversations with your students about their own experience shopping and trying on clothes. Those conversations aren't easy, they're emotionally taxing. A lot of it requires you centering yourself and talking about your own experience getting dressed. I oftentimes have to recount my own relationship to the research topic, but I think it's really important, if only to, you know, recognize within the space of the classroom that, you know, there's more options to students beyond designing for that ideal that's perpetuated within the fashion industry. So basically just acknowledging, as some scholars have said, the fat elephant in the room, that this is, you know, an issue that needs to be broached and addressed, and, you know, also one of the biggest opportunities within the fashion industry as well. I have more that I can say about dress forms and the design studio and stuff, but I'll let somebody else talk.
That's been something that I've been actively trying to address in my department. I teach at a very small university with small budgets. And when I started there, we had an assortment of PGM dress forms, but they were all size 4 through 10 PGMs. And so, you know, we've had students that are asking like, hey, where are the plus size dress forms here? I want to learn to design for that. And we're very lucky to have support from our administration. I framed it to the administration as, you know, this is a diversity issue and we really need to address this. So the provost actually did give us some budget to purchase, for starters, one plus size form. Another thing I've been trying to address in design classes since I started teaching those this year is fashion illustration, and kind of trying to break some of those fashion illustration norms. Like you've got 9 to 11 heads type proportions, and it's taught in a very standard way. So for the spring semester, I tried to seek out a textbook that kind of emphasized a little bit more naturalistic body proportions, because as the students themselves pointed out, when you draw a garment on somebody that is an idealized 10 heads tall, it looks nothing like what you end up sewing, so what's the point?
It's interesting. Yeah, I never even thought about illustration. Keena, I know you work with, your research is specifically about fashion design schools. So I wonder if you wanted to add to this discussion.
Yeah, no, I think as far as like my research and my experience from going as an undergraduate design student to a grad student studying kind of design discourse and education discourse, I definitely found that the mannequins was always the very first and foremost issue I think that students come across as far as being able to design for fat bodies. And I know companies now today, like Alvanon, are actually creating mannequins that actually have like curves and like a belly poof, or just kind of, you know, different body proportions that are actual people, you know, because I think, I don't know if any, like most of you probably have seen a mannequin. They can be very stiff and very just not padded in certain areas. And I know students that I've TA'd for in design classes have found it really frustrating when they go from patterning to using this mannequin and draping and then going to an actual human. There's definitely a big disconnect of going from these kind of like inanimate objects and patterns and stuff to fitting on humans, and how different it is, and how kind of unrealistic it can be. So, yeah.
Can I jump in? I have so much to say about this topic. So I recently won a grant from the Council of Fashion Designers of America, the CFDA, to promote plus size education at Columbia. So first and foremost, we bought some of those anatomically correct, really expensive Alvanon dress forms for our fashion studio, and I think we got 6 of them. It was a great first step, but it couldn't be the only step. The first issue or snag that we encountered is that our slopers or pattern blocks that we had in our studio weren't fully inclusive. So then we had to take some of that money and commission one of our pattern making faculty to create a fully inclusive set of slopers for our students. The next snag that we've encountered is in working with our modeling agencies for fit models. So what's really frustrating is that even though we've invested in these anatomically correct dress forms, and I encourage everybody to Google them because they have lumps and bumps like real bodies do, and you can actually choose different proportions, whether it's apple, pear, or hourglass. So we got kind of a representative sample. But then whenever we're working with these casting agencies who claims to have fully inclusive boards, whenever it came to brass tacks and we had to cast these models for our fittings for our students, the models that they sent us had radically different proportions and measurements than what we had requested and what we'd promised. So we actually had to end up breaking our contracts with them this semester in order to and worked directly with a plus size group in Chicago named Dream Big Midwest, where we ended up casting real women with real bodies to serve as our fit models, because again, like these agencies that claim to be inclusive, woke, whatever term you want to use, didn't actually have fully representative boards. So, and what's interesting is that I've, in having conversations with friends from Parsons and Ryerson and other institutions that are trying to push, a fully inclusive fashion design curriculum, they've encountered exactly the same problems. I almost feel like we have to have like a plus size education summit and all come together and talk about the challenges we've encountered and how we've overcome them, because it's structural and access issues that are really stymieing this work.
But it's also so interesting how these standardized sizing has really kind of engulfed the fashion industry at each and every level, right? I mean, as we lost also skills in creating our own clothing or changing our own clothing, we're even more reliant on what's out there, and it's a step so the way these norms are really ingrained in each of these objects that you were talking about. I wanted to segue quickly, since we're talking about mannequins, etc., and this idea of museums and collections. And I was curious, how can we bring these different bodies, and so their clothing as well, but also the way we exhibit the clothing, how can we bring that to museums, both in their collecting practices and in their exhibition practices?
So yeah, I came to be in charge of the fashion study collection at Columbia College Chicago last year, and it's a really amazing collection. We have 6,000 dress objects and about 4,000 works on paper, spanning the 1840s to the present, featuring American designers, menswear, children's wear, etc. But like most archives and study collections, there were gaps in terms of plus size fashion or stout wear, depending on which period you're looking at, as well as fashions for differently abled bodies as well. And so I, as people who are in charge of study collections can probably attest, there's not much funding for these collections oftentimes within these institutions. So I've had to kind of collect when and where I can, but then there are great challenges to collecting historic plus size dress, speaking from my area of expertise. Whenever I was doing my PhD, I wanted to study objects, and I reached out to FIT, the Met, all of the major institutions to see what they had, and they didn't have anything, unsurprisingly. Christopher Bird, in his work on menswear, the book's like 20 years old now, talks in his introduction about how he encountered similar problems trying to study historic examples of menswear, and he talked a lot about the survival bias that privileges the clothing of the wealthy and the elite, who also tend to be more slender. And he notes in that book that a lot of menswear ended its life in rags. And I think Hazel Clark has also talked about this in her work on everyday fashion. So it's that everyday, ordinary stuff that oftentimes doesn't get collected and doesn't get gifted to institutions that don't have collecting budgets. And so, I know the Met has also, been doing a lot of this kind of stuff, like shopping for Etsy and on eBay to try and find works by Black designers. And, that's, what I've reverted to as well. We have a wonderful auction house, Heinemann Auctions, here in Chicago, but, I've only ever seen one plus size piece ever put on the auction block. So it really is about like thrifting, finding stuff on Etsy and eBay, and kind of reading between the lines. And instead of, looking for like these designations on the postings that something is plus size or stout, actually looking at the measurements of the garment and looking back at old sizing and grading tables and seeing how that compares and what would have been considered plus size or stout back in the day. So, it's a hunt. The stuff is out there, but it can be difficult to find, and it almost never gets donated, unfortunately.
Oh, interesting. How people even self-selecting donation. Chari, did you want to add from your experience in collection?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of survival bias in that a lot of what survives is tiny, like Lauren was saying, both because, that's what was saved, and then also that's what may not fit as many people and doesn't get, passed around or remade into something else.
Oh.
The other factor that I think plays into that as well is that there's a really hot market for plus size vintage. I kind of overlap into the vintage community, and the demand for larger vintage garments is really high and drives prices up significantly, which then makes it even more difficult for museums to acquire them. Then you've also got the type of garments that are saved. My research in maternity, for instance, indicates that maternity garments were kind of viewed as primarily as a necessity, something, we've just got to wear this for a bit, and who cares about saving that? That's ugly. Some of them was what some of my interviewees said. So a lot of these simply did not get saved. And so they're difficult to find. Most women passed maternity garments on to sisters, friends. It got worn out. There was one that survived, a lady who her mother had made all her garments in the 50s, and it survived into the 90s. Her daughter wore it. It was a formal dress. But with maternity, just like with other garments, as Lauren said, often you only have things saved that were the very nicest. So for instance, Miss Peggy, the lady I had interviewed whose daughter wore her formal dress, she saved the formal ensemble. She didn't save anything else. And so you end up with that bias there in collections as well. And collecting it just really becomes a challenge because it all depends on what's available.
Yes, thank you. And Grace, you actually did an exhibition of adapted design. And I remember you had this very interesting mannequin. Can you speak a little bit about how you developed them, or did you buy them? Yeah,
and thank you for being part of that exhibition. I had the biggest problem of having a workshop, having the class successfully create these amazing accessible garments, and then being asked to show them on Fifth Avenue in the Arnold Sloan Gallery. And so I was thinking, how are we going to display these 7 amazing garments that were designed with long-term residents at a rehab center in Upper West Side? And how are we going to represent them, either using various body postures at different sizes? So I teamed up with one of my great colleagues and board members through my research practice at Open Style Lab, Pinar, and her architecture team at Sauer to literally CNC machine cut out these body forms that were modular through plexiglass, because we wanted to just try first plexiglass and we just didn't have time to think about wood at that time to experiment. But we started using that to think about, can we make a seated body, a hunched body, maybe a standing body? Can it be layered so it's more expansive in a larger size body? So modularity, laser cutting, CNC technology, I think really helped kind of make more of a custom way to represent different body types. It was done maybe not in the best way because of lack of time, but I think it was very timely because I know the Cooper Hewitt also had an Access exhibition, especially for disability at that moment. And a lot of the feedback from all of these exhibitions that, relate to disability is that it's always a second thought. It's never done or never considered when you're actually building the exhibit or trying to display the clothing. So I think that has been a great learning point. And I think for us to be hopeful in, history and examples and museums and archives have their biases, and it's great, but we have all the autonomy to create our own to make history, to add for education.
Yeah, and these mannequins were fantastic. I do remember it. I just want to veer a little bit into go back to representation. And this question is for Calla, since he works in media and communication. What do you think about costume design for film and television and the way they represent these all sorts of kind of bodies, but perhaps more specifically the fat body? Do you feel they do it accurately? They do it often enough?
Right. I really appreciate that question, and I hope that my answer can apply across some different categories. But when we think about how folks from historically marginalized identities are costumed, I think we really need to interrogate and be critical of the ways in which that costuming sort of reinscribes or reinforces our ideas around, like, for example, the dichotomy between the good fatty and the bad fatty, right? And so we can look at sort of the inclusion of characters like Kate on This Is Us and A.D. Bryant's character in Shrill as like, yes, finally we're seeing some representation. We're seeing like fat folks with great storylines that are complex, that they're not just falling back on certain tropes. But when we start to look at how they're costumed, and I'm taking a really broad definition of costume, like how they're presented, in many ways it's the good fat person, right? It's the fashionable fat person. It's the fat person who is middle class, upper middle class, right? I'm thinking about Kate and This Is Us, and how not only does costuming play into that, but also the fact that so much of what's happening for in that space in terms of costuming is not available, right? Like it's representing this sort of fashion utopia. I'm thinking of Shrill here, that is not available for in real life plus size fat people, right? All of the dresses for Shrill had to be constructed for A.D. Bryant because they did not exist. They were not available to buy off the rack, right? And so folks, there's a great interview with the costume designer for Shrill talking about that she was so shocked that she went to go and buy outfits for A.D. Bryant and couldn't find them. Whereas I feel like plus size and fat people were like, oh no, that's our reality, right? We would like to be as fashionable as the characters we see in many pop culture representations, but we can't, right? It's not available. So I think that that's something to keep in mind, not only what's sort of happening in terms of how they're being presented, but also how disconnected it is from the reality for folks from historically marginalized identities.
It's very interesting. Thank you. I had no idea that was the case with the particular TV show. I have one final question, and it's for everybody. I thought perhaps Grace might have more of an insight into this, but how do you think the COVID crisis has changed or will change the fashion industry? Will it push it towards greater inclusivity? I mean, will it not have any effects? I just think of like COVID, of course, is going to leave a lot of people with kind of long-term illnesses as well that might have an impact on the way they clothe themselves. I was just curious if anybody has any thoughts on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think with COVID kind of happening, companies are kind of forced to use the technology that's out there and really like adapt to be more accessible and to, well, just even just the fact that we're kind of working from home and not really being able to be in person to work. I think this technology push has definitely been an advantage, and it is in the forefront of fashion. This kind of like combination of fashion and technology to really provide a more inclusive fashion and just kind of experience. I think it's definitely beneficial for people with different abilities, people with different body types. I think it's kind of definitely pushing it along a lot faster than maybe it would have if COVID didn't happen.
Yeah, there's been a great article, I think, since COVID has happened on the Times related to disability. But like people with disabilities have been using assistive and various accessible technologies, you know, before we all hit the pandemic and had to start living indoors, because many of the physical spaces were not accessible. So I think it's a great learning point for us to look at that and what that might mean in terms of fashion narrative, but also like the consumer, and to pay attention to connecting in a more diverse way, especially when everyone's kind of at a more equitable like playing field. But this is speaking of countries that actually have, you know, Wi-Fi and internet, and where some people may not, which I found out sadly in some classes. But I think overall, there's also this idea of craft and returning craft. Like I recently put out on the Washington Post on how to make a mask, and you would think, oh, there's so many ways to make a mask, there's no right way, but you wouldn't imagine the amount of criticism and interesting commentary that comes from, I don't have a sewing machine, I don't know how to sew, I don't know where to put this. And it's interesting because I remember back in my grandparents' time, like that was a given. Like you knew how to do some basic tailoring, some basic things at home. But I feel like there's a resurgence of that coming back, especially when you are having to make with your means.
I really want to thank you for such an interesting panel and such interesting point of view. I wanted to get the chance to the audience to give some further questions. Can you give some example of adaptive clothing and for what sorts of disabilities they're designed to assist?
Yeah, I mean, Tommy Hilfiger, Zappos, as well as even Target recently. If you have Hulu, I definitely recommend watching Design for All, which is a documentary by Target. I think it does a great job of talking about the intersectionality of race, disability, and inclusion at a broader scale, and it has some great examples of what kind of clothes Target has been doing for people with autism. And then if you want the more academic version, I have co-written a book with a colleague at Hong Kong PolyU on more of the fabrication and possible technologies that can be applied in adaptive clothing that assists functionality, but also doesn't compromise style. So it ranges, and I think it really depends on the situation, the context, and the person.
And this has to do with education, unsurprisingly. How can we implement these changes, Veronica asks, into fashion design curriculums? Who enforces these changes? Because what I realize is there are way too many dress from between size 2W to 12W than there are for above size 12W.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a structural level when you come to academia. I've found kind of getting into it with directors and whatnot, and kind of having that openness to kind of change curriculum a bit. But really, I think what I've noticed from my experience and seeing other professors kind of really where they do it is adding these kind of, we start with adding these elective courses and these kind of alternative courses to design and mainstream design. And I think that's where change slowly but surely gets made. But it is definitely kind of a grueling process of, I guess, just kind of understanding the levels at which you can make change and whatnot.
You know, Keena, you mentioned the fact that it's oftentimes like a trickle down mandate, and trickle down mandates can be really difficult to enforce. You know, it's honestly good PR, especially with a dwindling pool of high school students who are going to college, to put yourself out there as an institution and say that we're pushing inclusive design for different bodies. And, you know, directors can make all these mandates and, you know, kind of hype everything up, bring in guest speakers, do film screenings, all that kind of stuff. But it really comes down to what individual instructors are doing in the classroom. You know, Grace, you talked about like human-centered language being at the core of, you know, inclusive design. And, you know, I know at least at my institution, like there's some skepticism amongst adjunct faculty and even full-time faculty about, you know, well, they're also like lacking the tools to some extent because we're all, you know, products of the education systems that we went through. But then there's also this problem of buy-in. I remember I was at Parsons and I sat on a panel talking about plus size fashion design. We actually had a question from a faculty member in the audience who, you know, said it outright. He said, "Is this irresponsible for us to be teaching plus size fashion because aren't we perpetuating, you know, an unhealthy ideal?" So there is that, even if, you know, instructors are afraid to say it out loud, there's this like hesitation about, you know, really pushing and implementing fully inclusive design because of the vast stigma that surrounds obesity. So I would say that in addition to, you know, having these trickle down mandates, you actually have to have conversations with your faculty and you know, see what they're seeing and understand what they're seeing in the classroom and what their hesitations might be, and also, you know, if they're well equipped to be able to teach inclusive design.
Lauren, I wanted to thank you for saying that, because that's something I wanted to mention before when we were talking about education, is that we need to acknowledge that, like, we come from a very biased and you know, fat-phobic, other-phobic type society, and that if the instructors are seeped in this themselves, you know, you can tell them, well, there's a market for plus size, there's a market for all of this, it's attracting other students, but the buy-in isn't there. And I appreciate what people are saying in terms of, you know, like maybe introducing these specialty courses is one way of doing it. But I also look at what Ryerson's doing, what Dr. Ben Berry did here and is going to go and do at Parsons. We're going to miss him very dearly. But just in terms of like affecting major systemic change, in terms of just turning the curriculum on its head and being like, you got to come with us. And one of the sort of the things that I think that the Ryerson School of Fashion and Ben has done in particular is reaching out to community and involving experts from other fields and bringing folks in, like, you know, myself, to talk about my research on super fat and infinifat folks over and over and over again, right? Not just once, not just for a special week, but in multiple classrooms in multiple settings. And I think that finding folks that have a similar commitment to systemic change in this space and building your community around them is what's going to affect this kind of change. And perhaps that's the activist hat that I'm wearing right now, but I look at what we've done at Ryerson and I'm really proud. And I think that I want more folks to look at what's happened at Ryerson and hopefully apply that blueprint to their institution.
Somebody talks about, in this question, Rose talks about postmenopausal women, and now we design for them and what kind of sizes and patterns we have for them. But somebody else named Denise Massman is then asking about women who had mastectomies and what kind of clothing is available to them. So I guess it's more of a general question now, despite the fact that we, as a society, we produce an enormous amount of clothing, we still fail to produce enough clothing for these kind of, you know, evolving and changing bodies, right? Being somebody who's going through pregnancy, being somebody whose size is changing or was through a mastectomy, or as this other person said, postmenopausal. So I was just curious if anybody had any question, any points about that. Charity, you were saying at the beginning how there is actually less sizing being produced rather than more, despite a lot of clothes being produced.
Yeah, this is actually, sorry, I'm going back to maternity again. That's where my brain is right now. My sister just had a baby, 2 weeks ago? And she said that there's been a lot of reduction in the maternity clothing that's available. And I think a lot of this is based on market. You know, you've got a lot of millennials who aren't having kids. And I think she had said there were at least 2 maternity stores she listed that are now out of business. I think it was either Old Navy or Gap is no longer carrying maternity, and they used to have quite a good line of it. And so I think all of this is ultimately determined by the market, and it's unfortunate. And I'm wondering if, as we see maybe more growth, kind of getting back to what we were saying about changes with COVID. I think we're seeing more growth in smaller, more targeted sorts of fashion, and I'm wondering if that's kind of where fashion is headed, is just smaller, more targeted audiences, like fashion for women who had mastectomies and that kind of thing, and if we'll see more specialization. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's difficult to make a completely one size fits all for all people, and there's a lot of, I think, beauty and also the bespoke that I think has such a rich history, and the techniques that I think come from fashion studies that I think can be actually applied a lot to more functional adaptive clothing. It's not like we need to reinvent new materials or new ways of doing things, but I think there's a lot of things that just both areas of, I think, health and then fashion could learn from each other in terms of making products. But when it comes to education, it's hard to really talk about that because we're always watching also the industry unless we have our own personal experiences. So there's, I think, where we link the advocacy, the education and the industry together is because we are experiencing it and trying to be as authentic as possible when we're trying to share that with students. At least, you know, even if you have a disability, let's say you have cerebral palsy, it doesn't mean that you're the same person or the same person with the same needs as another person who has cerebral palsy, because everyone's different in their own respective ways. So I think it becomes more customized, yes, but there is still a need for just our voices to be heard, and so our bodies as well.
This is with from Monica, Dr. Monica Sklar, who organized the panel with me, and it's about, she says, we have mostly spoken about women, and the speaker found the men's market is an area that is underrepresented in terms of ability or fat bodies.
I can definitely speak to that from like the plus size / beyond plus size angle, in that there is, you know, so many folks from my research project that looked at super fat and infinifat folks said that there seems to be so many more options in the men's side, and that for those that felt comfortable shopping on that side, it did open up some possibilities. I know Roxanne Gay in Hunger wrote about that as in terms of taking, you know, quote unquote men's clothes and tailoring it more towards her body. But I think that really does a disservice to folks that don't want to shop in that binary, that binary does not represent them. And I think we need to acknowledge the ways in which once you sort of get to the margins of the already marginalized, your choices are so limited that you know, you don't necessarily have the luxury of shopping for something that's, you know, being tagged with the gender that you feel, you know, you most closely align with, right? And that was really a finding in my project was sort of around the idea of, well, I have so few choices, so I have to take what's available to me. And so I feel like, you know, there may be more choices in the men's side. I think there is, like, we can talk a lot about how the beauty industry constructs, you know, plus size women versus plus size men, and the fact that it seems to be in our Western society more permissible to be fat and identify as male, and to sort of, you know, what that speaks to. But I think I would encourage more conversation around who's being left out in terms of even if there is clothing available at that size, it is generally very male focused and cut very male and branded very male. And who does that leave out?
That's very interesting. I had one of my master's students wrote about transitioning body and the need for, again, clothing that change over time, right? So, I mean, similar to maternity body, so a clothes that allows for a body that changes is in the process of becoming. I really want to thank you. This was so insightful. I've learned so much, and it was such a pleasure to talk to all of you at once.
Well, thank you. What an amazing, engaging conversation. Once again, we'd very much like to thank today's speakers for their time and their efforts working with us to put together this panel and taking this time this evening. Also, thank you to the organizers who collaborated with moderator Francesca Granata. the Costume Society of America board and board member Graham Westberger specifically, who runs our virtual content. And then CSA has an office with Kate On and Krista Miller-Zone, and we always are extremely appreciative of them. You can please follow Costume Society of America on Facebook, on Instagram. You can join us. And if you link up with us, you can hear about all of the conversations on dress that we're having. We have behind the scenes of collections. We talk to people in the theatrical world, authors. If available, please do consider donating to the Costume Society of America on our website. Your money would go in part directly to supporting this kind of programming. We want to keep some of this programming free and open access, and that would help it out. So again, thank you to everyone that's been engaging with us tonight, and good night.